Hi there, welcome back to Theology Savage. Last time we were together, we considered the gospel as it was first preached by God to our first parents after they sinned. We saw that Adam believed the gospel, the one who was to come, the seed of the woman who would come from the woman and crush the serpent's head, that serpent who had deceived them. Their sin brought death into the world, and of course their offspring would have his heel bruised. But what I want us to consider really is how the gospel plays out through two of their sons, Cain and Abel. In Genesis 4, we read that Cain was a worker of the ground and Abel was a tender of sheep. And the thing about that is they both bring these offerings to God. Cain brings, a grain offering in a sense. Abel brings the firstborn and, the best of the firstborn, the fatty parts. And we read rather interestingly that God had no regard for the sacrifice of Cain, and God tells him, if he does well, he'll be accepted. And so often we consider that passage in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews. It says that by faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. And we think that it was merely the subjective disposition of Abel's heart. It was certainly that to a degree, but what you have happening with these two, and we have to remember Adam and Eve hiding in shame, death spiritually, God giving the gospel promise and then believing that. We recall kind of the last thing that we read there in chapter 3 is that God clothes them with animal skins. And as you remember, the blood of the animals separated from the body, death, covering, and of course, they probably would have spoken with their sons about that, about how good they had it and how bad they were, how ashamed they were, how gracious God was, and how God covered them with a sacrifice. And so in the scriptures, you have really broadly speaking, two categories of sacrifice. One is a thank offering. Thank offerings are usually from the land. You also have guilt or sin offerings, which of course are blood sacrifices that require death. And so it wasn't merely the subjective disposition of Cain's heart that was wrong. It was the category of sacrifice. What Cain did was bring his grain offering. He was, in a sense, not believing really the holiness of God, the atonement that God would provide. He wasn't looking to the promise of the one who would have his heel bruised. And bringing the grain offering, he was in a sense saying, I'm okay, and here, God, accept this, rather than I'm not okay, and I'm sinful, and I need to be cleansed. And I guess the way that should apply to us is when we think of our Christian life, really the two great categories are thankfulness and, of course, atonement for sin. And the beautiful thing about the Lord Jesus Christ and the gospel is he not just bore in his own body on the cross that giving that sin offering sacrifice, but he lived a life of thank offering obedience to God. He did that in our place, in our flesh, for us, the scriptures say, all throughout. He came for us. He lived for us. And so certainly we should obey and give thank offerings of obedience as the Spirit enables us. But when we fail to do that, we must never ever forget that the guilt offering was given by the Lord Jesus Christ on the cross. And not only that, but the thank offering of perfect obedience through his whole entire life, loving God, loving neighbor in our place, for us, completely, exhaustively, for all who would believe. He is the thank offering and the sin offering, and longs to empower us to thankful obedience to God for those things and the good of our neighbor. So I hope you consider more fully Cain and Abel and why their sacrifices were accepted or not accepted. Be blessed.